The mission of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action is to bring all of American agriculture together with farmers and ranchers at the center to collectively identify and tackle critical long term issues. The focus is on the four R's today: right place, right time, right form, and right amount. The implementation of the four R's will help optimize the efficiency of fertilizer use and increase profitability and nutrients to the land. In the USFRA commissioned report called The Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative, it talks about the four R's under the crop production and yield gap opportunity and in the executive summary. Today, we will dive into each R with two experts from the Fertilizer Institute. They are Dr. Leanna Nigon. She's the Director of Agronomy and Research at the Fertilizer Institute, and also David Townsend. He's the Director of Member Programs at the Fertilizer Institute. Well, to get started, David, can you just provide the history of the four R's?
Yeah, for sure. So farmers are the ultimate conservationists. And so right around the time when precision agriculture was coming on the scene, for nutrient stewardship was being developed as a technology, as a framework to really support the specific placement of nutrients in order to ensure conservation on farm. This is a framework that is technology agnostic. It's really able to be applied to specific geographies, specific soil types, specific fields, with specific cropping systems, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So we'll get into talking about some of the techniques and practices that might be applied within the specific categories. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit of the background of the four R's and how it came to be. It's a way to not just make broad recommendations for growers across the country, but to really look at a specific grower, their practices, their goals, their management, and to figure out how they can move the needle on nutrient stewardship and be more effective in that way. So there's three different categories or elements that are really brought into the framework and how it relates to sustainability. So we want for our nutrient stewardship framework, we want there to be economic sustainability for that grower. We want them to be able to implement new practices that enhance their conservation efforts while also remaining profitable. We want there to be environmental sustainability, so to ensure that there's effective conservation of the land, that we're improving soil health, and that growers are able to do an even better job at their nutrient applications. And there's a social sustainability goal. So there's a positive community impact when growers are using for nutrient stewardship practices. And so those three sort of categories combine when we're thinking about how the four R's are implemented on a specific field or with a farm. We want there to be economic, social, and environmental sustainability considered.
Well, thank you for giving us that history. And I feel like a lot of farmers are probably doing these
Right.
four R's. We're just putting a name to them. But now we're going to talk through each one specifically, just so our listeners and our farmers and ranchers have an understanding if this is the first time that they are hearing about it. Let's talk about the right place. Leanna, what techniques have you seen farmers and ranchers utilize, and have they used any technology when it comes to the right place?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about right place, we're thinking about where is the crop in its growing stage so that it can actually access that nitrogen. So oftentimes we see growers utilizing a starter fertilizer. That's a great example of how we're getting the nutrient to the right place for the crop. Those roots are very small. They need nutrient placed very close by to those roots so that they can access that to then grow up. And then as we go further through the season, we can actually extend where we put that nutrient in the field. We can place it out a little farther away from that rooting zone, which we want to do. Nitrogen can be quite a salty fertilizer, and so we don't want to burn crop roots. So we can place that a little farther away as those roots are bigger and can grow out and grab that nitrogen as well. You'll hear me talk a little bit more about each of the four R's, and they all really blend together. And so when we think about right place, obviously we're kind of thinking about the right time too, because we want to think about what's happening as that crop grows. Where are those roots going?
Right. Before we go to right time, David, is there anything you wanted to add about the right place?
Yeah, I think with nitrogen specifically, Leanna covered a lot of what we'd like to share in regards to right place. Yeah, that's great.
So, Leanna, now let's talk about right time. What techniques have you seen farmers and ranchers utilize, and is there any technology that's been added to help with that?
Yeah, so we've seen that farmers are really trying to split apply their applicate their nitrogen. So we want to see those applications happening closer to when the crop really needs that nutrient. So for corn, I talk a lot about corn because that's the uh, needs a lot of nitrogen. It's where most of our nitrogen sales go towards is corn. But the corn crop, when they want to take up that nitrogen, it's similar for some of the other grass crops too, is later in their growing cycle. So for corn, that's, later July, and it's before that grain fill really takes off. And so we really want to target getting our nitrogen on close to that as possible. And so that's why in-season applications, maximizing that timing aspect of the 4 hours is really important with nitrogen. The other thing that I want to point out with nitrogen is we call nitrogen the leaky cycle, and it's because nitrogen is very easily lost. And so the more that we can maximize getting that nitrogen to the crop where they can take it up, where they're more mature, they're able to pull up a lot of that nitrogen from the soil, the better we are at getting the nitrogen in the crop and keeping the nitrogen out of our waterways. So timing is a really big one for nitrogen management.
And we'll have to ask later if that one causes the most stress for farmers, 'cause the timing of weather and all those things can be really
Yes.
hard to pinpoint. One thing I'd like to ask, you said split apply. Is that similar to variable rate?
So split application would just be instead of applying all your nitrogen in one big swath, we are actually going at one time. So maybe pre-plant, we're going to break up those applications. So maybe we have a little bit of nitrogen in the starter. We have some nitrogen as pop-up. So we're going to put it with the seed and then we're going to put it off the row a little bit. So there's two applications that are really happening, but they can both happen with the planter. But one is targeted for that seed, and then the other is targeted for once those roots grow out a little bit. And then you can also do another application, V4, V5, whenever you can get back in the field. And then there's some applications that happen pre-plant, which, before the planting even begins. So we're really thinking about, okay, what are we putting down and when are we going to put it down so that we can make sure that it's still there for when the crop needs it. And we want to optimize getting those applications closer to when grain fill is going to happen, closer to when that crop is going to be at higher maturity and takes up more of that nitrogen. So when I say split apply, I mean breaking those applications into many applications. Now, what you're talking about, variable rate, this is an important tool too. So this is more tied to rate. So I'll hold on to that one until we get there.
Okay, thanks. David, is there anything you wanted to add with right time?
Yeah, I just would reiterate what Leanna was saying about nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle being very moisture dependent, very water dependent, or water impacts the different transformations that happen throughout the nitrogen cycle. And so when thinking about timing, you mentioned weather, that is a huge consideration when a grower is thinking about their nitrogen application at various points within the season. And so if a specific soil type or part of a field is maintaining a high moisture level, it might be difficult to get the nitrogen to that plant that it needs at the right time. And so, yeah, lots of considerations. There's lots of different factors related to water and the implications that weather has on that with the nitrogen cycle.
So we've covered right place, right time. Now let's talk about right form. Leanna, what techniques have you seen farmers and ranchers utilize?
Yeah, so right form is really, we're going to work with right form to optimize when we're talking about weather. So depending on what kind of climate you're in, that's where we're going to hit on the right form. So, and what's available to a grower. In certain areas of the country, there are more forms that are more easily accessible and more cost effective for a grower too. So we're kind of playing with two elements here. There's many different forms of nitrogen that are available. Like I said, you can target using starter fertilizers, but then when we're talking about our big bulk applications, anhydrous is an option, anhydrous ammonia, which can be fall applied or applied in the spring before planting. It's a really good product. It kind of acts as a natural inhibitor, but we want to make sure that we time that so that we're not losing it all with the moisture. So this is a great source. It's actually the highest nitrogen source available as far as the nitrogen content, 82%. So we're not going to find anything else like that. And then we have urea products or UAN, aqueous ammonia products as well. So those also make some good base sources. Now, there's also some technologies that are available to go along with these sources that make them really more effective in the field. So we're talking about enhanced efficiency fertilizers or EEFs, and these are all your stabilizers, your inhibitors, your polymer-coated ureas. And these can be extremely helpful tools when it comes to weather. So we have a lot of research that TFI helps to support. And there was some numbers out of research in Minnesota where we showed, using a polymer-coated urea can reduce your ammonia losses, so gaseous losses, greenhouse gases, etc. So ammonia plus greenhouse gases, but we can reduce those losses by about 80% for ammonia, and for nitrous oxide emissions, we can bring those numbers down lower, more than 50% lower. So these EEFs, they can really help make sure that that nitrogen stays available in the soil. And what that tells me is if we're not losing it to the air, we're not losing it as ammonia, or we're not losing it as nitrous oxides, we're keeping it in the soil. There's the risk of leaching, of course, but we're keeping that more available to the crop as well. So we really want to utilize those EEFs, or enhanced efficiency fertilizers, inhibitors, stabilizers, et cetera, and making sure that we work with those to basically combat what we have for problems with weather if we have a lot of rain or a wet season.
Leanna, would you say the technology in this space with the right form has really taken off in the last couple of years? What has that been through your experience?
Yeah, I mean, we've had inhibitors and stabilizers around for a long time, but this technology just continues to be improved. I mean, we see a lot more products available to growers for them to kind of hone in on what exactly they want for a product to stabilize their nitrogen, or inhibit that process of hydrolysis. So for urea, we have urease inhibitors, so slowing down that process too. There's a lot of products that are out there, and there's a lot of new products like biologicals that are coming out that have some inhibiting claims as well. So we're keeping an eye on all of these products. There's also the biodegradable polymer or biodegradable ureas, coated ureas that are to replace the polymer coated ureas. And there's a lot of innovation in that space too. So, there's a lot of interest, I would say, from outside groups, environmental, regulatory, on making sure that we're stabilizing our nitrogen, whether that be through the coated ureas or the inhibitors. And so there has been quite a bit of innovation in this space, and I think a lot of interest from growers because they use them and they know that they work. And so, yeah, definitely a lot of traction in the last few years too.
Right. Really exciting times to be a part of. David, is there anything you'd like to add about the right form?
No, Leanna covered it for us. Yeah.
Right. Let's jump to that last R, right amount. Leanna, what techniques have you seen farmers and ranchers utilize?
So right amount with nitrogen is hard because we don't soil test like we do for phosphorus and potassium for nitrogen. There's some soil tests available, or stock nitrate tests that are available to look at how much nitrogen is left over after the season, but it doesn't stay stable like nitrogen, or like phosphorus and potassium stay stable in the soil. So nitrogen, the best way that we can manage nitrogen is based on our overall yield productivity. And so with the new technologies that have come out, we see that growers and advanced farmers and crop consultants who are really doing a good job out there are splitting out farms into management zones. We hear this kind of language, and really they're separating out more productive areas of the field from least productive areas in the field, to then maximize that nutrient uptake for crops that really do need the more nitrogen to hit those yield goals. So that's an example of where you would see variable rate of nitrogen application that you had maybe alluded to earlier, Joanna. So we can do variable rate of nitrogen, but we're not hitting on it the same way that we do with soil testing. But we can see that a lot of our recommendations for nitrogen are yield goal based. And if you have really productive soils, they hold on to moisture, they hold on to nutrients really well, high CECs, high organic matter, we're probably going to have a more productive plant that needs a little bit more nitrogen to get them there. Whereas, some of your sandier, lower production soils, we might not need to be putting as much nitrogen on. So that's really where we can optimize that rate there.
David, is there anything you'd like to add about right amount?
No, that's great. Yeah, I think Leanna hit on it.
Okay. Now let's kind of reflect on all four of these R's that we just talked about. Leanna, I'm assuming we want all four R's to be working together. That might not always be the case. Is there a top R that makes the biggest impact for a farm?
Yeah, so when we're talking about nitrogen, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but timing really makes a difference. We're playing with the weather here. And so if we can really maximize our nitrogen uptake for the crop and put that nitrogen on when the crop can take it up and wants to take it up, that's really to our benefit. And the way that we optimize that timing is not only with, when we go into the field, but also using innovative sources, whether that be EEFs or picking the right source, knowing that that nitrogen is going to be around a little bit later. So timing is tricky with nitrogen, and we acknowledge that, but we kind of use those other 3 R's to help us get to that better timing.
David, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think timing is definitely a huge factor when it comes to the 4 Rs and ensuring a productive cropping system. We've talked about it, I think, with each of the other 4 Rs too. Timing is important with rate, with the source. And so, yeah, I think that's the probably number one consideration for a lot of folks, especially with other factors that might influence their decisions throughout the growing season, like weather and like regulation and other factors that come in there.
Before we talk about other practices, we're covering the whole United States when we're talking about these 4 Rs. From your guys' experience, how have you seen these differ from, Leanna, you just made a comment, someone that has really productive soil. What about those soils that do require a lot of irrigation or, they do have drought? How have you seen some of those challenges with soil types across the United States be impacted?
Yeah. So soil type is huge. And like you mentioned, irrigation systems too. If you're working in an irrigated system, you're kind of controlling your water and your moisture a little bit more. We kind of have a better guess as to what's happening with the nitrogen. And we can implement things like fertigation as well, which is an excellent tool for nitrogen management. So if you have that irrigation system, that's great, and have that fertigation availability, that can really help with the 4 Rs for nitrogen management. But to your other point about your soils, productivity of your soils matters, and when we think about soils and nitrogen management, what we really want to think about is how are we losing our nitrogen. So if you have a sandy soil, you're going to be prone to leaching. Okay, it's going to move through that profile. If you have a more waterlogged soil, you have puddling in your soils in the beginning of the spring, you have heavy clays, then we're thinking about, okay, you're more prone to lose nitrogen via denitrification. And so if we can kind of classify, we know how the nitrogen is going to transform in these different types of soils based on how they handle moisture. We can kind of target in, okay, these are the type of products that we need to use. These are the sources, these are the inhibitors, et cetera, for each of these types of systems.
David, are
Yeah.
there any, was there something you wanted to add?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. David, are there any other practices that, let me rephrase that. David, are there any other practices that need to be in place to maximize the results of the 4 Rs?
Yeah, I think from a base level, you need to have a good crop management system in place in order to ensure that the 4 Rs are giving you the response that you're looking for when it comes to nutrient management. So things like considering your planting date, what your pest management system is, your use of herbicides and fungicides, some of these basic on-farm practices that just need to be in place in order to ensure your crop is set up for success, even before you're talking about nutrient management. That's definitely something to consider when you're thinking about how to maximize the result and the response of 4R nutrient stewardship. In addition to that, you think about other conservation practices that you might have in place, in addition to those that might be categorized in the 4Rs. So again, some of these may sound very basic, but definitely have an impact on the effectiveness of some of the concepts and the practices that Leanna was speaking about earlier. Things like buffer strips or installing grass waterways if you have water running through your field, contour farming, or other practices to prevent erosion, considering your drainage practice if you have a tiling system, or the other needs of your soil type and your geographies that might impact the different 4R practices that we've spoken about here today.
One other thing, I think cover crops, would that be a piece that's in there? I'm from Wisconsin. Hear a lot of people talk about legume credits. Anything you'd like to add on that, whether that's Leanna or David, when it comes to adding cover crops? I know these are basic, but they do make a really big impact with nitrogen.
For sure, yeah. And I think that cover crops often get seen as the silver bullet solution to all of our conservation issues across the country. And for a lot of fields, a lot of growers, a lot of regions of the country, cover crops are a great value add in order to ensure that we're preventing erosion, and often can have an additional market opportunity there too. But if you're looking at sandier soils or places where it might not be as an effective of a practice, thinking about southern Arizona, or even in the Mid-Atlantic region with sandier soils, there's a lot of things to consider, and not just saying that cover crops are the blanket solution. And that's kind of what we've talked about here today with the 4Rs, is thinking about your specific geography and region and how your soil type, climate, the different sources and products that are available to you can really impact your crop management system. So yeah, I would definitely say cover crops are a huge tool in the tool belt, but definitely can be something to consider as you're making decisions on farm.
Yeah, and I would just add a little on cover crops. Yes, great tools for conservation agriculture as far as keeping green on the landscape. But thinking about, what kind of cover crop are you using?
Mhm.
There's some cover crops out there that are geared towards fixing some nitrogen. There are some cover crops that are nitrogen scavengers. So, we see a lot of rye. Rye is a great nitrogen scavenger. It'll take up a lot of nitrogen that's going to be leached. So thinking about, how is that cover crop influencing your nitrogen dynamics as well? They're going to need some nitrogen, and they're going to scavenge some nitrogen that might have been lost to the environment too. So, when you implement a cover crop, we're definitely going to play with that nitrogen rate, with the different rates of your application for your crop, to make sure that it's honed in appropriately.
Right. We're trying to share a buffet of options, hopefully get those gears turning on what you could be adding to your farm. Couple more questions as we wrap up this interview. David, what challenges can farmers face with the 4Rs?
I think with any new practice you're implementing on farm, there's risk associated with it. That's when it's helpful to look at studies like Leanna mentioned about EEFs, to see that there's a good return on investment. And so what that looks like for the 4Rs, that can often mean using your least productive field or a portion of your farm to try a new practice or to implement something like that. So I think farmer adoption and the risk associated with additional or new practices is always a challenge that growers are going to face. But those are things that are within your control as a grower. There's also lots of challenges that are outside of your control. We talked about the regulatory space and how that can impact a grower from year to year and the decisions that have to be made. And so that's something that TFI and the fertilizer industry as a whole has really looked at when it comes to the 4Rs and voluntary nutrient stewardship programs. And so in 2012, executed and began the 4R Advocates program. There's government affairs staff in our office that do a fantastic job of talking about grower sustainability story and fertilizer industries work in sustainability on the Hill. But really, it's even more effective when you can get someone who lives it day in and day out to tell their story and to talk about how these practices actually impact the land that they manage. And so the Advocates program is a way that growers can do that. It's an avenue to share that story. And we've gotten some great examples of growers and their ag retailers who are excellent spokespeople for the industry and can share a lot of these practices that they're implementing on farm. And you'd like to learn more about the program, we're always looking for additional folks who are willing to step up and use their voice to talk about what they're doing on farm and just share, some of even some of the basic and seemingly everyday practices that they might be doing. But if they have a conservation bend and are looking to be a spokesperson for the industry, they can just visit our website at tfi.org/advocates and learn more about the program and sign up to use their voice as an advocate for the industry.
Right. Farmers and ranchers are the best voices to be sharing those
Right.
messages too. Last question as we wrap up this episode of Farm Food Facts. I'd like to get both of your perspectives. David, I'll have you go first. And Leanna, if you could add, what trends or topics are you keeping an eye on in the space of nitrogen fertilizer management?
Yeah, I'll hit on equipment a little bit. I think there's always new, shiny and innovative equipment technology that is available to use. And again, tools in the toolbox. And so when it comes to placement technology, I think when we're talking about fertigation, I've seen a lot of some of the use of Y drops or the ability to really spoon feed fertilizer right where the plant needs it at that specific time and at that specific rate. And so that's something that one of our current advocates uses right now that's been really innovative and fun to learn more about. But yeah, there's different placement technologies that will in row will have a variable rate and the ability to really put that fertilizer right where that seed or that more mature plant needs it. So I think, yeah, there's always equipment to look at that's fun and innovative to learn more about. So that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on.
And Leanna, from your perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation in
Yeah.
general in the nitrogen management space. And David touched on a really good one, machinery. We're always seeing advancements in machinery and placement, whether that be on the planter or with an implement. But a couple other places, EFs, we touched on that earlier with Source, the enhanced efficiency fertilizers, inhibitors, stabilizers, and then these coated ureas. Lots of innovation in biodegradable coatings on those ureas. So that's a big area too, as well as improved science on the inhibitors and stabilizers. Of course, biologicals and biostimulants. We hear a lot about biologicals and biostimulants and, their potential to improve nutrient use efficiency. So there's a lot of research happening in this area. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where a lot of this goes. We see examples of them working really well in certain circumstances. And so I'm interested to see, how does this become a broader area of science? So that's another big area. The other thing that I would say is data is a big area for nitrogen management. We see a lot of modeling, AI modeling. Kind of the biggest roadblock I see with nitrogen management is that nitrogen transforms really quickly. It's very challenging to characterize that in a model and then be able to capture that. And then on top of that, weather, how well are we able to predict our weather day to day? We're pretty good at wind and cloudy versus sunny, but precipitation, we still haven't quite locked that in perfectly, where we get different precipitation, different areas, and that's really what's driving our nitrogen management. So, there's some areas that we, as weather modeling improves, that my hope is that, we can also improve some more advanced modeling of nitrogen and what that might look like across the season. So yeah, there's a lot of really exciting avenues when it comes to nitrogen and areas of science that are touching nitrogen management, EFs, modeling, machine learning data, biologicals. And then, of course, there's a regulatory space out here that is influencing all of this as well. So as we see different regulations pop up, our nutrient management reduction strategies like in Wisconsin or in Minnesota, those all influence our nitrogen management too. So those are the areas that I'm keeping my eye on.
Well, you sound like you're going to be really busy. You guys aren't bored at all at the Fertilizer Institute. I hope this episode kind of gave everyone that whole basic, what are the 4 Rs, got you up to speed, but then gave you some knowledge, or maybe you heard some terms that you can further go look at the Fertilizer Institute to get more information, or talk to your local extension and figure out how you can add or implement to your farm. USFRA plays the critical important role of creating opportunities for collaboration, information sharing, and solution development for the full agricultural value chain. This episode is an example of that. We appreciate the time from our guests, David and Leanna, and we appreciate you tuning in to learn more about this topic. Tune in again. I'm Joanna Guza for Farm Food Facts.